everyone. My name is Liz Hyman, and I'm the president and CEO of the XR Association. And as we're just giving a minute to gather here, I want to thank everyone for joining us. And maybe what I'll do is just start with a little background for why we're here today, and then I will shift into introductions for our esteemed webinar panel, which I'm really excited about. So some of you may know that about almost a year ago, not quite, we released a white paper, The Future of Immersive Technology, that was the result of a long standing effort, our Future of XR Advisory Council, where we brought together probably 60 plus individuals across civil society, industry, academia, law, government, as diverse a group as we could to cover 5 different topics. One was on youth, one was on privacy, interoperability, norms and behavior in immersive spaces. And the thing that brings us together today was respect and diversity with XR, particularly in the workplace. But I think we all agree that even the themes that we talked about that are particular to the workplace are things that are universal, regardless of whether you're in your consumer space or in the workplace. And we put the paper out. We've been doing a series of webinars, and this is now our 4th webinar. It tracks to each of the working groups. And the wonderful individuals who are on the webinar today helped us with the Future of XR Advisory Council and in sort of surfacing a number of important topics. And so the purpose of today's webinar is to revisit some of the things that we talked about, but bring us up to date. There's a lot that has happened actually since we released the paper in February. So we wanted to be able to talk about that and then sort of think about what that means for our society, for our workplace, and for public policy as well. So with that, I am going to ask each of our folks to introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Heather Shen, who's in my upper left corner. So Heather, do you want to say hi to everybody?
Happy to kick it off. It's great to be here and excited to have this conversation today. I'm Heather Shen. I'm one of the co-founders of Praxis Labs. And at the highest level, Praxis Labs is an immersive learning platform where we build critical human skills to help leaders and businesses. We create AI simulations so that companies like Amazon, Target, Uber, and more can all upskill their people managers and drive behavior change that really helps create more inclusive, more engaged, and higher performing teams. So excited for this conversation today.
Awesome. Thanks, Heather. And Dylan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Liz. Hi, everybody. I'm Dylan Fox. I am the Director of Operations for XR Access. We are a research initiative at Cornell Tech focused on making XR accessible to everybody.
Fantastic. And Carlos.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, everyone. I am so thrilled to be here, and thank you to the XR Association for putting this together. It's a really important conversation. I'm Carlos Gutierrez. I am the Deputy Director for Legal and Policy for LGBT Tech. We're a national organization that focuses on the intersection of technology and LGBTQ plus communities and marginalized communities more generally. A big part of our mission is ensuring that XR is not only innovative, but also equitable. We engage with regulators and industry, and we often speak on policies and regulations related to this space. We also work with program creators that prioritize accessibility and inclusion with specific initiatives that I'll talk about a little bit later. And through these initiatives, we are aiming to foster a new standard for XR technology that is not only engaging, but also inclusive. And we absolutely believe that XR has the potential and should be a tool that everyone can access and benefit from, regardless of their background or abilities.
Awesome. Well, as you can see, a wonderful group. And in fact, Carlos, I'm not going to wait until later, as you said. I'm going to come right to you and ask if you can elaborate a little bit more on some of the programs that you all are working on, but how XR technology specifically are impacting the communities that you work with.
No, absolutely. I think there's a lot of examples of kind of the positive impacts of XR technologies on our communities and underrepresented communities generally. Some of the places that we see the most potential is in areas such as like immersive training programs. I think that XR is starting to transform how companies approach diversity by offering immersive training programs. I know, for example, I've seen samples of organizations that have created VR experiences where employees can step into someone else's shoes and experience environments where they may be experiencing implicit biases and challenges. This kind of training has been shown to be more effective than traditional methods at fostering empathy because, and anyone who's been in a VR headset or in one of these spaces knows that the immersiveness and immersive nature of these headsets are completely different experience than like a Zoom call or any other kind of training. So because of this kind of immersiveness, these kind of programs are something that really helps build empathy and really allows participants to feel how unconscious bias or lack of accessibility can impact people in a daily way. If you're speaking more specifically towards the LGBTQ plus community, I think that one of the areas that we see as being ripe for transformation is the ability of VR and XR generally to create more and better LGBTQ plus safe spaces. And this is the same for any other underrepresented community. Safe spaces are something that our VR allows to do easily. We have been very actively involved in creating some pilots and collaborations in VR environments, specifically aimed at the LGBTQ plus community. We have created LGBTQ plus worlds in Meta's Horizon, as well as other collaborations that we've done with platforms such as Inner World that provide peer-to-peer counseling services in VR spaces. In a more fun but still meaningful approach, we created a number of viral Instagram and TikTok augmented reality carousel filters. And these filters allowed a carousel of LGBTQ plus representative flags to come kind of scanning around. And when it landed on a specific flag, that flag would become a facial makeup. So people were able to wear this makeup. And these filters have actually gone really viral in a massive way for us. And we have had well over 100 million engagements over the past 2 years on these filters. And it's a way that people show identity. It's a way they show pride. They talk about, we have a number of examples where people for the first time in a video have talked about their identity when one of these flags happened to land in a way where they were like, I've never been able to talk about this. So it's just a fun way to do these things, but again, very immersive.
Yeah.
Our initiatives want to be focused on and make sure that these environments respect privacy and foster belonging, and that they're especially critical for those in regions or communities where physical LGBTQ plus resources are limited or inaccessible. This way, people who are in those spaces where they may not be feel welcome in their physical space enable individuals to interact in safe and moderate spaces, and they can connect with resources that may not otherwise have access to.
Yeah. Wow. There's a lot to unpack there. One thing I just wanted to dig in first before I shift off to Dylan, and I know Heather's going to have a lot to say about job training, so we'll parking lot that issue. But you mentioned safe spaces. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of safe spaces for the LGBTQ plus community? Like what do you mean by a safe space? Because I think it can mean a lot of different things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's a couple of things that we can talk about when we talk about safe spaces. One is obviously, when we talk about online spaces, social media spaces, gaming spaces, there's a lot of conversations around targeted harassment, discrimination, and hate speech. So in VR, again, because of its immersive nature and because of how personal experiences can feel, the impact of hate speech or kind of abuse can be felt much more strongly. So we're very, very careful and very focused then on making sure that people have the user tools to kind of control their spaces, that they have the education and the knowledge to know how to use those tools, that the companies are providing flexibility in their designs that allow people to use those tools as well. Another area that we talk about a lot when we talk about safe spaces is, from a company and in an industry perspective, is the areas of privacy, data protection, and all of those issues that come up with kind of when you have such an immersive environment. Again, how do you protect the privacy of the people who are coming in? How do you protect the ability for them to be there safe? One of the things we talked about all the time is just, an avatar. Avatars are, cute. They could be, very cute, like little wee kind of figures, but a lot of people we found out there's a large number of our population that may actually use an avatar to kind of test out their gender identity, or maybe present in a gender identity that they don't present in real life. And this could be a very private thing for them. They could be taking a step out in a virtual world to present who they are, that they would not be taken in a physical space. And the protection of that data is really crucial. So in terms of protecting and giving user tools to people to make sure that they have the ability to protect themselves and block as needed, as well as the companies making sure that they are taking into account that marginalized communities face more of these attacks, and that the data minimization and privacy protections that they're putting in place have to be responsive to these heightened needs.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, a lot there, and I think we'll come back to some of the policy discussions a little later. But Dylan, I wanted to shift the conversation to you. XRA has had the privilege of working with XR Access now for probably 5+ years. And you all do an outstanding job on all kinds of things, various projects that are trying to create accessible immersive experiences for people with disabilities. I know we have partnered with you on community discussions along a number of different topics, but wondering if you could talk a little bit about, some of those projects, but in particular, how it is that collaboration with underrepresented communities actually, results in good design practices and XR solutions that are good for immersive experiences.
Absolutely, Liz. I think a lot of people may have heard the phrase "nothing about us without us," right? And there's this idea that if you are trying to work on something that is aimed at a disabled population, or even something that's just aimed at the general public, if you don't have active collaboration with people with lived experience of disability, uh, you're not going to create something that's very good and useful for folks, right? Because it's very easy to assume that you know what somebody else experiences, what somebody else needs are, um, but there's no substitute for experience. And I think we take that very seriously, and that's why we're involved with a number of programs aimed at making some of these product and research cycles more inclusive, including some of those communities. We're working with a program called Vera, which is the Virtual Experience Research Accelerator, that is trying to make VR research more inclusive. Because, oftentimes you'll find when you're trying to run a research program on any campus in the US or elsewhere, um, it's very easy to say, okay, we need 10 research subjects. The first 10 people that show up in the lab are going to be it, right? And you often end up uh, with subjects that tend to be disproportionately white, male, abled, young, and when products are made based on that research, lo and behold, the products are work better for people that are white, male, young, and abled, right? And so by changing it at the kind of the earliest steps in that research phase, we're hoping to create a body of knowledge that is more informed by people of all different stripes, right? Um, we've also seen and supported a number of different companies and other organizations that are trying to incorporate lived experience into their products. For example, we were at a meta workshop a few months ago where we were working with quadriplegic users to invent a future controller that might not depend on your ability to be able to open and close your hand easily, right? Things like that. Um, I'll pass it off because I know there's a lot to talk about today, but one last thing is that it's really important to think of disabled people not just as testers and as consumers of technology, but as creators. I think that's a place we still see a huge gap, is that the technology to actually create XR applications is still very difficult to use for people with certain types of disabilities, especially vision and motor disabilities. And we really would love to see a future where disabled people are not just brought in to help test things, but are on the teams. They are ideally employed or leading teams, and free to help make these products come to fruition and to express their own visions, and not just be limited by what the interfaces allow them to do.
And I would suspect that's a theme across all underrepresented communities, you know, the notion of being able to help design and build the experiences that will lead to better respect and diversity in the workplace or wherever it might be. One thing I'll point out and share with the audience, about 3 or 4 years ago, XR Association partnered with or worked with the Partnership for Employment and Accessible Technology, which is a program, PEAT, at the Department of Labor. And we put out a report that talks about accessible technology in the workplace, but it also cited, I think it was the Chamber of Commerce that had done a study talking about sort of the missed opportunity to tap into an incredibly able workforce, in this instance, the disabled community. And it actually talks about, you know, dollars and cents, like you're going to make more money if you tap into this community. So I commend people to that report, and I think it sort of fits in with what you were talking about, Dylan. Heather, I'm
Yeah,
going
and
to
the only thing I will add is obviously, just to double down on what Dylan said about the importance of having collaboration with underrepresented communities. Designing XR solutions with underrepresented communities is the only way to make sure that we don't risk creating tools that are inadvertently reinforcing existing barriers or fail to meet actual barriers. And this isn't a complicated thing. There are so many things that I talk to people about that are just basic things that are, something that affect our community, and they just don't have the bandwidth to think about it. So reaching out and working with these communities is an easy way to kind of get an easy win and get a temperature check to make sure that what you're doing isn't inadvertently making a block just because you're not aware of some of the issues that some of the community might face.
Yeah, great point. And Heather, I do think that's a great segue. I mean, there's so many things that we've already talked about: workforce training, inclusion, not only in, you know, who uses it, but how it's built. So I'm curious at Praxis Labs, you know, and the programs that you're working on, how you think about some of these themes and topics, and how that informs the work that you do.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think at the end of the day, all of our customers, a lot of our partners, the talent and learning leaders we work with, they all want to know, how does this have an impact on the business outcome? Because research will show time and time again that inclusive leaders help retain employees better, they help engage their teams better, they create more higher performing teams. And historically, we actually haven't been able to measure any of that. If leaders are applying any new learning that they had from their training, or thinking about measuring the skills development or growth through this training. And so what I think is so powerful about immersive technology, about simulated learning or experiential learning, is that we're able to actually measure everything that someone does in a simulation. What are they saying? Are they applying new skills? What are the areas that they might need to improve, or areas of strength already? And so with that, you can actually create a connection between, one, our learners growing and developing, and then two, how are they actually thinking about that implication on the business and how their team communicates, how they're able to engage diverse perspectives, how they're able to better create goods and services that can serve a greater population. And so the connection between, the immersive technology and measurement and being able to actually build these more inclusive leaders really does have an impact on how businesses can show up in the day-to-day world.
You know, it's so interesting because I think we'll get to this conversation about, you know, how to win over the C-suite. And I think that's in large measure what you're talking about when you can show that sort of quote unquote return on investment. But one of the things that has changed notably since we released the paper is sort of the advent of AI, but in particular, large language models, generative AI. And I would imagine that development is playing a big role in what Praxis Labs is working on. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, research will tell you that in order to acquire a new skill, you really need to practice it. It's not that different from, practicing a basketball shoot, or clearly I don't play basketball because I just said basketball shoot. But is not that different from practicing an athletic skill. Practicing inclusive leadership or durable human skill, you actually do need to get coaching. You need to think about how you improve. You need to try and fail and try again. And with AI, we're able to actually do that at scale way more dynamically and responsively than we've ever been able to do before. And so, at Praxis, we provide clients and their workforces with these fully responsive practice simulations for pivotal moments that might happen in the talent lifecycle. So think giving feedback or setting performance expectations or managing disagreements, kind of these, moments where otherwise someone might be going in for the very first time and doing it, or they might have an issue that they didn't expect and they don't feel confident navigating that. And all of these simulations are embedded with a human-centered lens. So we focus on these, what we call critical human skills, because to us, it's not enough to have a standalone diversity and inclusion training. It's, we don't just put on our equitable and inclusive hat half of the time and then take it off for the other half of the time. Creating an inclusive workplace happens in how you navigate these critical moments, like hiring and onboarding, performance reviews, promotions, firing. It's really what makes a culture. And so I think by giving leaders and people managers the opportunity to practice before they ever get into that moment, we are creating these judgment-free spaces where they can practice and fail and try again and really develop their skills.
And I would imagine AI allows for a more realistic interface. In other words, it's not sort of that stilted press A, if this is the answer, press B, but it's a more natural interaction. Is that sort of a significant difference maker in your mind?
Absolutely. I think because it is so responsive and dynamic, every time that I go through an experience, it's something a little bit different, or, the character responds differently to something that I'm saying. And it really does start to feel even more immersive that you're in the conversation, you're talking with someone, and you're actually thinking, oh, how do I get through with them? How do I deliver this piece of feedback? How do I make sure that I'm understanding their perspective? It adds a new layer that I think a new layer of immersion that I think we previously weren't really able to capture before.
Yeah. Anybody else have thoughts on sort of the rise of AI and its marriage with immersive tech and what it might mean in your field? Yeah, Dylan.
Yeah, I think it's both an amazing opportunity and a big risk, as I'm sure everybody who's working with AI will know. We've seen some really exciting opportunities for AI to help be a more kind of responsive and reactive way of supporting people, especially those with disabilities when it comes to trying to use XR. We have a research program at Cornell right now focused on sighted guides, right? Which is this idea that if you're in a real life situation and you're blind, where you are in a new space, you might ask for a sighted guide to help guide you around the space and answer questions about the environment. Um, and that has a lot of potential for VR spaces as well, right? Both in terms of other humans being sighted guides as well as in AI sighted guides. Because I think something that uh, a lot of people here will have experienced is that XR is very different from the internet, right? And just having a screen reader may work very well for an HTML web page, but it's a lot harder to get right in an XR environment. And so using AI to help, oh, excuse my cat coming through here, having AI
Speaking of
help.
sight cards, but yes.
Yeah, exactly. Having AI bridge those gaps can be potentially really powerful. But the flip side of that is that these AIs aren't just magically created out of thin air. They're based on training data. And very often that training data is not necessarily inclusive. And so we need to be really careful about algorithmic bias and this idea that AIs may say things that are ableist or racist, or they may embody those discriminatory attitudes because that's how they were trained. And so I think we have to be careful about that. We obviously have to be careful about the other, challenges with AI in terms of making sure like artists and creators are getting credit for their work and compensation for, the fact that their data is what's fueling these AIs. And the energy and water consumption, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think it's like a magic bullet, but it definitely has a lot of potential to help disabled people and other marginalized groups if used correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. Cost benefit analysis for sure, and how to maximize the benefit as much as possible. I would imagine provenance of data is a big issue.
Hmm.
I don't know, Carlos, were you about to say
Yeah,
something?
sure.
Okay.
Again, same thing, two sides of a coin, right? AI has incredible potential to really help kind of curb misinformation and hate speech and some of these issues that we're talking about. But on the other side of the coin, AI, it's like Dylan said, it's not a perfect system. I think there's this perception, and I think less so now, thankfully, but there used to be a very broad perception that AI was like this neutral, God figure that knew better than humans did. And therefore we should trust AI because it didn't have the human foibles. And we realized very quickly that's not true, especially for marginalized communities. With LGBTQ plus communities, for example, algorithms in social media or YouTube, when people start liking, thumbing down LGBTQ plus videos because they don't like LGBTQ plus content, that's training an algorithm to see that our content is less than or less desirable than. So discrimination creeps into the systems. And the problem is when you have a system that relies on millions of inputs to make a decision, it is impossible to see what exactly did what. So we have to be vigilant. We have to stop treating AI systems like they're the end all and be all for equity and really become much more kind of watchful about how these AI systems are being trained. And companies have to be much more transparent in what their bias mitigation attempts are to make sure that these systems are not unintentionally discriminating against marginalized communities.
Yeah, a couple things that I've seen out in the marketplace. For example, there's a company called Shell Games that is for games for kids, but I think there's a lesson there. They use something called ToxMod, which is an AI moderation tool. But what it does is it siphons down to the most egregious items so that human moderators can then engage and problem solve. So that's one example. And then I was recently at a conference and heard from a couple different organizations, from a corporate level, that a lot of them are creating sort of tailored LLMs, like within their own ecosystem, to be beneficial for their employees. And I would imagine, that that's one way to think about this is how do we make sure the provenance of data, certainly in the workplace, is something that we
Yeah.
have given thought to.
And we've done that. We have an internal AI system that we created just for LGBT tech. It is a closed system, no one else has access to it. And it really is astonishing how quickly this system gets to know the organization and our kind of our vision and our arguments. And now I can ask it a question and it will respond with our values and it will respond with our arguments. And it is just incredible that it's just going to get better and better as we train it more. The privacy obviously is a huge concern and
Yeah.
something that we're very good on. But these systems do have the potential to revolutionize how we do business and what we focus on going forward as part of our daily work.
Yeah, indeed. Well, we've sort of started to unfold and unpack the next part of this conversation that I wanted to get into, which is some of the challenges to all the work that you engage in, and how to develop and enforce inclusive, diverse, immersive experiences, wherever you may live. And Dylan, I know you talked a little bit about Vera. And maybe that's the entry point into something that I know you feel strongly about, which is creating sort of a gold standard level of technology that has agnostic accessibility standards. Can you unpack that one a little bit for us?
Absolutely. So standards are a really important part of the conversation around accessibility. For years now, we've had for web the WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And this is kind of the gold standard for web content, right? If your content, hi cat, if your content adheres to WCAG, then it is going to be accessible to pretty much everybody, right? Accessible to the full population. And there's always edge cases where that may not be 100% true, but by and large, that's the case. And because of that, organizations can confidently put something out on a web page if they stick to best practices and vet it whatnot. But they can confidently put something on a web page and know that everybody will be able to access their content. And we don't have that right now with XR, right? What we have is this kind of mishmash of applicable standards. Some stuff from WCAG applies. The W3C put out this XAUR, which is XR accessibility user requirements. That's kind of a prototype. There's things like the game accessibility guidelines. There's things like the meta virtual reality checks for accessibility. But a lot of these tend to either not be fully applicable or only be applicable in certain situations, or are kind of intended more as best practices, right? If you follow these, your application will be more accessible, but that still doesn't necessarily mean it will be fully accessible. And what we really want with this program, which we're working along with XRI with the Metaverse Standards Forum, where we've got an accessibility working group that we've started. We are trying to set that comprehensive list so that when an organization that has accessibility requirements, such as schools, such as hospitals, we want them to be able to confidently say, here is our XR program that we've created or that we've bought, and everyone here will be able to use it, not just in little pilot programs, not just with their abled users, but everybody. And we think that is a really important kind of benchmark for enterprise adoption of XR, because no big organization wants to go full forward on XR if they're afraid they're going to be sued because they don't know whether their applications are accessible and they can't prove that their applications are accessible. So that is a really important project for us. And I'll quickly pitch. We're having an informational webinar about that on November 7th for folks that are interested. So I'll put that in our panelist chat and maybe we can share that with the audience.
That's great.
Mhm.
And yeah, just for people who are not familiar with the Metaverse Standards Forum, it is a big, wide-ranging volunteer group. I think they had over 2,000 participants across many different working groups. And what it's trying to do is organize standard-setting bodies to address issues that are specifically highlighted by the community that need to be worked on and collaborated on in order to achieve the success that you just talked about, Dylan. So highly recommend folks check out the Metaverse Standards Forum because I think there's a lot of good work going on there for sure. So Carlos, switching over to you, I know you mentioned earlier Innerworld as a place that is trying to create a wonderful community, peer-to-peer counseling. Can you talk a little bit more about that effort and what are some of the challenges that you see and how's it going in terms of overcoming some of them?
Yeah, absolutely. So Inner World is a VR app. It's not only VR, but it was created from the ground world as a VR app. And it is peer-to-peer counseling. It is HIPAA certified. They created their own very beautiful world. And they're now like represented, like sponsored by Jewel. Jewel has become a very big mental health advocate, and she has done a lot of work around the space. Our relationship with them was kind of based around how do we use these tools for LGBTQ plus people. And what we did create was a space where there was an LGBTQ plus meetup within Inner World. And that meetup was, on Mondays, and it was for an hour and a half. And there was a peer-to-peer counselor who's been trained by the Inner World staff, and we were there just answering questions and hanging out. And some of the things that we found doing this is really interesting. Generally, these spaces have become so important for identity expression and privacy in a way that it might be overlooked in other spaces. And so some of the issues that we really saw and some of the areas that we thought it was really strong um, was representation. The ability to create an avatar and an environment that reflects diverse identities, cultural background, gender, race is such a key thing, but it's also a major challenge. There's a lot of platforms that are not doing that well. For example, you can, if you're opening an avatar store with clothing, having a male and a female clothing section may not be the most inclusive way to look at things, or not having the ability to change the skin tone of your avatar may not be inclusive. So representation is really important. Yeah, like I said, many platforms offer limited options for identity expression, which can leave underrepresented groups feeling excluded. But I think there's a lot of progress going on, and a lot of the platforms are incorporating customizable avatars, for example, and settings that allow users to really change their look and how their feel of their avatars. Another area that we talked about in the reason that a space like Innerworld is so important, it is a safe space. It's a place where people can go where they know they're not going to be harassed. So privacy and safety is one of the big challenges in creating spaces like this, but also one of the big opportunities. As they become more immersive, data, consent, and safeguarding of people's privacy and identity are really crucial, especially for communities that experience discrimination and harassment. So privacy tools are really important, and even though they are improving, and platforms are adding stricter moderation and customizable privacy settings, ensuring that those spaces keep evolving is really crucial. And finally, something that's kind of obvious but not often mentioned, just cultural sensitivity and bias reduction is a big challenge in these spaces as well. Ensuring that any training that is being done in these spaces, or any onboarding content that companies are getting involved in, any packages that they're buying from third parties or creating internally, that these packages resonate across different cultures and identities and are not just targeted at one demographic. And that really does require kind of a nuanced understanding of different backgrounds, which goes back to Dylan's point about having people at the table that represent the communities you're going after is so important. So, these guidelines are being developed. I know that, XR Association is very focused in creating guidelines for industry that help kind of highlight these issues and foster the growth of these kind of conversations. And continuing to talk about those things will be really key.
Yeah, I'm going to sort of veer off a little because I just looked at the question in the question box, and somebody wanted to know whether this discussion is covering just the consumer experience or also advice for developers. And I think your discussion around assets and representation of avatars, I think, is something that's spot on for developers to be thinking about. I mean, there are many themes that we've heard about throughout this conversation, but does anyone want to take a stab at answering, developers versus consumers as you're thinking about your different communities?
I can talk I talked a lot though. If anyone wants to jump in, I should jump out.
Well, maybe, I don't know, Dylan, Heather, do you want to go first and then we'll come back to Carlos?
Yeah, I'll just say I'll echo what I said before about it's really
Yeah.
important that we make sure that developers are empowered, no matter where they're from or what abilities they have. I would also say that the needs for developers and consumers can obviously be very different, right? I think when it comes to developers, one of the things that we still are trying to get out there is more examples of open source accessible XR code. That's one of the things we're hoping will come out of the Vera project. But it's amazing how much code is proprietary. And if you're a developer trying to start off in XR, it can be very hard to find good examples to learn from. And so that is something that I would put, for example, in the category of we need better examples, better kind of role models, particularly when it comes to accessibility influence code uh, for developers. And I think XR Access has done a lot. We have, of course, our collaboration with XRA on the GitHub, trying to make it as easy as possible for developers. Is very important, but it's also very good to acknowledge that not every developer is going to factor in accessibility, unfortunately. And so having tools for the consumers is really important as well. Either tools like maybe the walk-in VR driver, for example, that is kind of an aftermarket thing that will let people apply accessibility settings to kind of any experience. Things like the Xbox Adaptive Controller, I'd love to see a variant of that works more with XR. We need to give people the ability to empower themselves, because unfortunately not every developer will do it for them. So it really needs to be both sides of the coin.
Yeah, and just to elaborate a little bit on what you mentioned on the GitHub, so XRA has a series of best practice guides that are geared towards the developer, giving advice on how to build experiences that are safe and ergonomic, or that have good community standards and norms and behavior. We worked with XR Access and others on an accessibility best practices guide. And we took that guide and then used that to then create a GitHub site. I think it's XR GitHub, but I can't remember the exact title. And there's an amazing array of resources in there, from, papers and reports to actual code, to help developers make more accessible experiences from the start. So great. Heather, anything from your perspective to add on this, or?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would add is like, as we were talking about earlier with the advent of AI and all these new technologies, one of the things that we've noticed internally at Praxis is like, where are the areas that as a developer or as a creator of these experiences, where should you spend, more time and intentionality? Like previously, we would spend a lot of upfront time curating the story, thinking about how we're representing the characters. And I think as we have incorporated AI more into the generative part, the more and more time is now spent on the testing and guardrails. And so as you think about, the most important areas and the technologies that you are using within these experiences, I think my advice or kind of like experience has been just thinking about what are the moments of, where you would might need a human in the loop the most to really oversee and make sure that you are being intentional with the representation of these experiences.
And Heather, I want to stick with you because when we were preparing for this conversation, I think this is relevant for all of us. And we started to talk a little bit about this earlier on, but part of this is about building acceptance from corporate leadership. And you guys are actually working with corporate leadership in many, many ways. And I'm just wondering, like, how do we build more support, more engagement from corporate leadership in order to expand how we're building diverse and inclusive experiences in the workplace?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we touched on it a little bit earlier about how we can connect this really to the business outcomes, because we are in this really polarized moment right now where diversity and inclusion have become politicized, and a lot of corporate programs are getting these backlashes. And so I would say most leaders that we talk with, they agree that the research is there, that inclusive teams outperform, that they produce better goods, they produce better services that reach more people. And I think the challenge in this is really disentangling the politics and fear of backlash with what can and should be common sense to embed within any leadership program. And so I think finding the opportunities to embed in existing work, finding the opportunities to create, what are the practical skills, frameworks, ways that you can apply your learnings or this new technology into an existing program is one way that I think we've reached a lot more corporate leaders and leaders who are thinking actively about creating more inclusive leaders.
Yeah, great thoughts. Anybody else want to add to that before we move on to other topics? No? All right. Well, I would say I hope that in the years to come, we're more impactful with C-suite leaders, and that some of the data that is starting to come back, because it is a measurable experience when it's immersive, will start to have that type of sway. So I think that's great. XRA, we do a number of things. We're trying to do research and best practices and create those developer guides and highlight ways in which industry is working to address so many challenges that are before all of us, whether it's in the workplace or consumers, ensuring that we create trust and reliability of the technology, whether it's XR, AR, MR, digital twins, any of it. But we also work quite a bit with policymakers, and really trying to educate the policy world about the technology and how it will work, what work is being done to address some of those challenges. And I just wanted to take a moment to ask each of you, what, if any, do you see as the role of policymaking when it comes to your particular areas of focus? I don't know who wants to start with that fun one. Dylan?
Yeah, I could kick it off. I think the big thing that I would see as an opportunity for policymakers is to support public research and open source development, because you know companies are doing some great work in XR, but by and large, company code is proprietary, right? It's not easy for one company to build on another company's work. And I think we see when you look at the web has been the fundamental technologies that make up the web were kind of open source at the get-go for so long, and it let us create this really wonderful thing that made it so that almost anybody could put together a website and have it be pretty good. um, and I think with XR, because we're kind of starting out 20, 30, 40 years later in this environment where everybody builds their own thing and kind of keeps it private, from the code end at least, it becomes a lot harder for the smaller groups to um, really build something for themselves. And I think that's doubly so, again, when it comes to examples of accessible code and having good open source things that people can build off of. And I think there's a big role of the government that's kind of been lost a little bit over the years, of being a source of public funding and public investment that everybody can build off of together. We see that somewhat through investments in research through groups like the National Science Foundation, which God bless them, have been putting a ton of money into accessible XR research. A lot of those have been funded by the NSF. So I would just encourage policymakers to support that type of public open source development, and also to be proactive. Don't wait until the lawsuits start coming in, um, because that is just going to take way too long. And unfortunately, by that time, a lot of the tech is kind of settled, right? There's that multi-year gap between something getting big enough that it's worth suing over, the lawsuit resolving, then finally the company gets told you need to make this accessible and goes through and has to try to retrofit everything. So much better to be proactive about it. And so the more that policymakers can do to try to define and encourage accessibility and inclusivity, and to make sure that these are built right from the start instead of retrofitted because they have to be, is going to be a much smoother experience for everybody.
Yeah, and great points. A couple things just to highlight. Totally agree with you on the National Science Foundation, and also NIST have been two organizations that are really focused on what you were talking about. There's something called the Chips and Science Act. The chip side being repatriating chip manufacturing here in the United States, but the science side being investing in research and development along the lines of what you talked about. And there is specific reference, something that XR Association worked on to make sure that immersive technology was included in the suite of emerging technologies that are covered by the Chips and Science Bill. Now we have to get the money appropriated. It's been authorized, it needs to be appropriated. So good ideas and good discussions with your members of Congress are important. And I think what you talked about is spot on. And I would also say, in terms of building things with accessibility in mind, I mean, that's exactly the reason that our member companies wanted to do the accessibility guide and to work with organizations like yours, that it has to be a discussion now and not after the fact. So spot on. I don't know, Carlos, you've talked a lot about privacy and other issues from a policy perspective. Any thoughts that you wanted to add in?
Sure. I mean, I will reiterate that policymakers, have an incredibly important role in ensuring that XR environments are created in a way that are equitable and accessible. We've already talked about a little bit about some of the policy. First thing I'll plug that I plug in every speech I do, we need a federal privacy law. We need to pass a law that covers all of these different industries, and it's insane that we still don't have one. It's not a matter of reinventing the wheel. A lot of the things that are being applied in other contexts apply to XR VR spaces as well. A lot of the current laws that regulate tech can apply to us. The privacy and data minimization kind of goals that we have in general now are just as applicable. So I don't think that there's this as much of a rift between kind of regulation versus innovation as we think, but I do think that industry has a responsibility to take a leap forward and be leading in terms of figuring out how we're going to tackle this. We all know law is always going to be lagging behind kind of where the issues are. We saw that with AI. The conversations are still ongoing on how much of AI we can regulate. We've seen some of the problems that AI has. I think industry has a place here to kind of create their own regulations, start kicking the tires on some of these things and seeing what works. If you don't want bad legislation, you really need to start from a place where you're proposing good ideas that have been road tested. So policymakers are incredibly important, obviously, in terms of data privacy, content moderation, and ensuring that experiences are safe and inclusive for all communities. And proactive and inclusive policymaking will be a foundation to protect marginalized communities, and it has to be taken into account as policies are being created. It is the protection of marginalized communities.
Yeah. Heather, anything to add in on this one or?
I mean, I think one of the things that we touched on earlier was like the importance of regulating AI and thinking about where the data is from, what it's being used for, how is it trained. But I think one alternative idea to throw out there, or additional idea to throw out there, is kind of the role of policy and thinking about like how we can use these technologies, thinking about the fact that training for the last 20, 30 years has been so stagnant. It's been, e-learning or stand and deliver training. And I think there is really an opportunity for us to think about how do we shape the future of learning to make it more practical, proactive, engaging, and leverage all of this technology that we're exploring and learning more about for the use of education and learning. And so I'd be really excited to see how we continue to think about the use cases for XR and immersive learning.
Yeah, and I'll do one little shameless plug as well, which is, access to the technology is going to be vital. And one of the pieces of legislation that our organization worked on, and we'd love to see it get a little traction in a coming Congress, is the Immersive Technology for the American Workforce Act, which would redirect grant dollars to underserved communities so that they can have access to, whether it's VR or MR or AR, but tools that will help them to get skilled and upskilled in professions and really, thrive and succeed in the workplace. So that will be my little shameless plug in the conversation. But I think where I want to sort of wrap up with all of you is being very forward thinking. I know a lot of us think that in 2025, 26, AR and AR glasses are going to have a very bright future. But, what's your vision, for the next 3 to 5 years? What would you like to see? And where do you think the industry is actually going to potentially meet what your hopes and aspirations are? So, Carlos, I know we have 8 minutes, so
I'll do it
let's.
quick.
Okay.
I
That's a lot
actually,
of time, actually, but yeah.
no. In terms of what I see, I actually had the opportunity a couple of weeks ago to test out the Meta Orion glasses. And Frank, it is transformative. And I think that wearables is really kind of the killer move here. I can see a world where, so with the Orion glasses, this is a prototype that Meta is developing as what they see as a future. And they're already kind of the form factor is already the same size as a Ray-Ban pair of glasses. They're still a little heavier. But when you put them on, you have a whole full holographic screen in front of you that's completely interactive, just with movements of your hands. And basically, you're just pinching. You have apps in front of you. You can play games with your palm. You can do all kinds of things while keeping the environment around you. So I was playing with somebody else in the same room, a virtual game of Pong, having a conversation with them, chatting. So I think for the future of this, once wearables in kind of integrate AI as well as holographic displays, it can definitely be the smartphone killer. It could be the next iteration of technology. In terms of what I want to see, I want to make sure that we have and that we prioritize ethical and transparent policy standards around the data privacy and the psychological safety, and ensuring that marginalized groups feel secure using these platforms. There's going to be a lot of privacy concerns. We've already had a lot of issues around privacy with these smart glasses and recording. Those are just going to continue as the AI gets more sophisticated. And once we kind of look at this in 3 or 5 years, I can see a place where these wearables and other technology like this become a vital tool in transforming workplaces, making them not just accessible, but also really inclusive and empowering and really adaptable to each specific person's needs, which is something that's kind of a dream now. But after the demo, it seems closer than I thought it was 3 weeks ago.
Fair enough. I think we're still a few years away, but it
Yeah,
is amazing to actually feel and try that future. So, Heather, where is it for you in 3 to 5 years, and how do you hope it really enhances your goals and aims?
Well, I'm really excited about the moment and chance for simulations and AI XR to get to a point where it's just fully embedded in the things that we do within the flow of work. It's connecting all of our tools, it's connecting all of our services, it's accessible like when you need it, and it can serve up all of these like learning and simulations, like in terms of like what you need and when you need it. It knows how to support you in that way. So I'm excited for that moment.
That'll be exciting. I guess, I mean, to put a fine point on it, I guess the idea would be I could take a training course from Praxis Labs and I could start on my iPhone and I can, transfer over to an immersive VR experience or then ultimately into wearables. So
Yeah.
I think that's, where it's all headed, and with an overlay of a digital twin somewhere, I would imagine as well. So it's kind of exciting. Yeah. Dylan.
I think what I'd really love to see in the next few years is a bigger focus on just kind of out of the box accessibility, right? We have a story one of our blind friends told at the last symposium of I booted up my headset and it gave me a code I had to read off the headset, and I had to go talk to my neighbor across the hall to get them to read the code off for me so I could log in, right? And I think I would love to get to the point that I think Apple Vision Pro has actually kind of led the way on this. When you boot that up in the same way that you boot up an iPhone, it starts off saying, "Do you need accessibility settings? Here you go," right? And if we could see the other headsets in the market get to that level where when you're not expected to have certain abilities in order to even be able to participate in this, right? That we have these experiences that developers are thinking through, that platform owners are thinking through and supporting, maybe with a path smoothed by AI where individual developers drop the ball. But I'd love to get to that point where we are looking at these as an opportunity for inclusion instead of exclusion, right? Where we are getting to the point where anybody can pick up and use these technologies regardless of their abilities, regardless ideally of their language or of any of the other factors about them. I want to see this technology be for everybody, and that I think is what we're really working towards.
It's funny. I remember talking to an accessibility expert and designer at a certain company, and he referred to that as sort of the moonshot for accessibility, that it's out of the box, ready to go.
Hmm.
I hope it's not a moonshot. I hope it's a simpler process, and really making all of these technologies, easy to use, trusting, and safe experiences for people. I think is all of our shared desires and goals for this. And it is exciting. It's exciting to see how these wearable technologies and AI and immersive experiences are all coming together, converging to create a lot of options for people. I think, it is incumbent on industry to create tools that allow people to figure out and customize their experiences in terms of their level of privacy and comfort in those spaces. And I know a lot of hard work is underway every day in that regard, because at the end of the day, if people don't trust the experience, then we're all out of luck. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today. It's really been a great conversation, and I look forward to many more in the future. I encourage all of our viewers to check out these different organizations because they're really on the cutting edge, and exciting to see the work that they're doing. And if we can be of any help, please let us know because that's what we're about. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.